Later on, a groundswell of anti-international adoption militants made it impossible for North American adoptive parents to tour the country as we had with our children. More importantly, however, orphans are still adopted internationally in Guatemala. Travel was safe when we took our children to Panama. We toured the canal, the city, and the quaint Spanish colonial slum where laughing children ran after our van and asked us to take their pictures. In the midst of our sightseeing, we met with the miners' court and formed a child-placing agreement. After our return, we found families for 5 orphaned children until tragedy struck. Evidence piled up to prove that the Panamanian dictator, Noriega, controlled money laundering and drug traffic. In 1989, the United States invaded. Jet fighter planes carefully selected a target for a strafe and burn operation, the slum of wooden houses, where Noriega ruled his command headquarters. The truth did not escape our children, who saw it on the 6 o'clock news. "We were right there," said Omar. The girls ran to find the pictures from our trip. "What happened to all the laughing boys who ran after us in our van?" Kirk wanted to know. I didn't want to hazard a guess. At the time, I was packed for a fact-finding trip to a poor but quiet country to visit an international adoption agency founded by an upper-class socialite in Guayaquil, Ecuador. Its name is loosely translated as the Foundation for the Adoption of Our Children. The agency was similar in its organization and administration to the adoption agencies in Colombia. An added bonus was that they had motel-style rooms on the premises so that the adoption parents could stay close to their children during the adoption process. The country remains peaceful to this day, and orphans are still adopted internationally. The same could not be said for Peru. A bloody internal struggle with the guerrilla movement, the Shining Path, went on for years. I visited the government child-placing authorities in Lima, Peru, as well as the American consulate shortly after government buildings, including the courts, had been attacked, and rockets hit the U.S. Embassy in Lima. Here the adoption process was also in the hands of private lawyers and the court. The procedures took 1 to 2 months. Our intrepid adoptive parents stayed together in hotels. While they waited for their final adoption decrees, they bonded with their babies. They kept flashlights, candles, and pails of water at hand, because they never knew when the water or electric supply would fail. To reinforce their ability to terrorize, the guerrillas liked to set time bombs in the utility plants. My worst nightmare occurred when I got caught between floors in my hotel elevator when the guerrillas cut off the power. Alone and in the dark, I could only wonder what would happen next. When I finally managed to pry the doors open, I jumped down into a kitchen where flabbergasted staff sat around in candlelight. Graft and corruption, rampant on all levels, impacted adoption until the National Institute for the Protection of Minors decided to stop private adoptions and to set up a new system. Los Niños International was the first agency to be licensed in Peru, a grand occasion with radio and television stations on hand to broadcast the event, and included a speech that I delivered in Spanish. Fortunately, no one present knew how I struggled to write that speech, or how many times I practiced my pronunciation with our Peruvian adoption representative. After one of my trips to Peru, I flew up to La Paz, Bolivia, the poorest country in South America, and with a capital city at the highest altitude. Mountain sickness, not guerrillas, was the enemy there. My host, a lawyer, was also a family man with a heart. He tended to my headaches and shortness of breath with local remedies. When I was finally functional again, he escorted me to the orphanages and showed me something I had never seen before. A turnstile built into the wall of an orphanage was watched over at night by shifts of nuns. It saved some innocent lives. In the cover of night, desperate mothers relinquished their babies to the nuns instead of abandoning them to death from exposure. Although the topography was harsh, the country remained relatively peaceful, and orphans are still adopted internationally. My research also led me to Paraguay. I went through the usual channels by meeting with the National Director of Family Welfare, and also with the only international adoption agency in that country. We formed a child-placing agreement, but as we coordinated adoptions, we heard disturbing reports that Paraguayan lawyers intercepted impoverished birth mothers before they could relinquish their infants to the adoption agency. The lawyers offered these infants to North Americans for half the weight but twice the fee. After a few years, the Paraguayan adoption agency closed its doors. They no longer had any infants or children to place. The greed of entrepreneurs and lawyers, as well as the willingness of adoptive parents to pay almost any fee for a white baby, finally got the government's attention. They intervened and put a permanent moratorium on international adoptions. Around the same time, I realized that our location in Austin was not the best place for an international adoption agency. We needed to be closer to the consulates, which were all in Houston, and to the international airport. We settled in the Woodlands, a planned community 30 miles north of the city. I didn't have time to dwell on the fact that I had just turned 65. Nor did I realize that my new home was only 90 minutes from my first POW camp in Hearne, Texas. I was too busy as I moved the office and the household and hired new employees to make the connection. Later on, prospective adoptive parents born in nearby towns where I was once a captive, like Hearne and Mexia, became clients, and the circle between countries that I had completed finally became apparent to me. Soon after our move, a second national organization, the National Council for Adoption, NCFA, grabbed my attention. A national non-profit advocacy and information group, they are often called upon to provide information and testify before Congress on adoption-related issues. The NCFA and JCICS involved themselves in the study groups on the Hague Convention for the Intercountry Protection of Children. I jumped in to take an active part. It became a goal of mine to see the convention ratified by the United States. Study groups were attended by such august personages as Hans van Loon, Secretary of the Permanent Bureau of the Hague Convention, Peter Fund of the State Department, and Harvard law professors and deans from prestigious schools of social work. As I listened to their findings and opinions, and occasionally added my experiences as an adoption practitioner, I couldn't help but feel gratified that as an American, my voice and my vote were given equal consideration. During the time I opened some of the first adoption programs in Latin America, Korea and Vietnam had sent thousands of children to the United States for adoption. The first children to arrive after the Korean War were children fathered by Americans. Later on, full Korean orphans were brought to America for adoption. 3,000 to 5,000 Korean orphans were adopted each year until the Winter Olympics were held in Korea. By then, Korea was a prosperous-looking country. Broadcasters who covered the games mentioned as an aside, "Korea exports its homeless children." The Korean government was embarrassed and promptly decreased their flow of orphans abroad. I had looked into adoptions through Korean child-placing entities, but older adoption agencies were way ahead of me and were already coordinating guardianships for Americans. Communist China seemed like an unlikely place for an adoption program, but I made inroads with Chinese graduate students for several years before we started to place babies in 1992. We were one of the first adoption agencies to set foot in China at the invitation of the Chinese government. How incredible it was! The Chinese could not have been more hospitable. They even went so far as to take us on a tour of orphanages and let us take photographs. Later on, the authorities created the China Center for Adoption Affairs, CCAA, to supervise adoptions throughout the country. This eliminated the possibility of criminal activity in orphan placements. Certain provinces in central and southern China looked like they would have baby girls to place for a long time due to the frequency of abandonment. Yet I knew that anything could happen to compromise orphan placements. In this case, it wasn't the Chinese government or the American government, but instead the fact that every established agency, as well as new ones and the usual entrepreneurs, met with the Chinese authorities and started adoption programs. We had placed several hundred Chinese baby girls before we discovered that we were just one of hundreds of adoption agencies who claimed to have an adoption program in China. China has since curtailed applications from new agencies and has developed a licensing procedure that requires relicensing every 2 years. Chinese procedures are the benchmark for adoptions in Asia. After all the ups and downs with Latin America, I made backup plans for this new Asian adoption source. Experience showed that I had been right in contacting a lot of countries in order to form child placing agreements in Latin America. From an agency standpoint, it was never wise to depend on just one country. Vietnam beckoned me. After all, I had followed the war in Vietnam with my heart in my mouth while my sons were draft age, and I still kept up to date with current events. When the United States lifted the embargo and Vietnam welcomed Americans, my son Kirk and I travelled there to meet authorities in charge of adoptions in 2 different provinces. I wondered what we'd find in the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. More than 50,000 American soldiers, 200,000 Vietnamese soldiers, and 2 million Vietnamese civilians were killed in the longest non-war ever fought by the United States. In terms of development, the country didn't look much different than it had on the nightly news more than 2 decades before. Hardest hit were displaced ethnic minorities, the Muong, mountain people. Kirk and I travelled there several times. We hired a representative and built an orphanage in the Social Protection Center complex in Hoa Binh province. Both Kirk and Tatiana brought infants and children to their parents in the United States while proxy guardianships were still possible. On one trip, Kirk and I travelled to the orphanage and brought back 2 babies. We placed the babies with their parents and wished them well. 2 months later, the mother of one of the infants called to tell us her baby boy was dying of spinal meningitis. Within a few short days, the baby died. Everyone was in a state of shock. Jean told the bereaved mother that she would send her a remembrance of the baby when we made our next trip to Vietnam. 6 months later, a Vietnamese taxi driver took us up and down a street where shops sold funeral items. We 2 Christians sadly chose Buddhist memorial items for a grieving Jewish couple. A year later, relatives, friends, and our agency assisted them financially so that they could adopt again from Vietnam, this time a girl. In 1999, Jean and I travelled to the Social Protection Center to meet our representative, DM, who was also our project manager. She said the officials wanted to show us self-help projects they had planned for the surrounding villages. Well-child clinics, agricultural cooperatives, and technical schools were shown to us. The last project was in the jungle. After a training period, lychee trees would be given to the Muong to raise as a cash crop. We were guided to a small clearing where several stilted bamboo huts clustered around a well. A family waited inside to serve us tea. I could see the woman hold the hand of a tiny girl with the face of an adolescent. DM said, "She is 19 years old and profoundly retarded. She was born after the war, after her father was sprayed with Agent Orange." At that moment, the father burst into the clearing. Happy and full of smiles, he greeted all of us. His left hand was missing, severed during the war, DM said. When the man came over to me, I realized I was shaking hands with a North Vietnamese soldier. Yet he had no more choice in the matter than did our American boys of that era, no more choice than I did in World War II. "We had come at an auspicious time," he said through DM. "The Lunar New Year is a special time for Vietnamese." That same day, we were also served tea by the village chief, who invited us into the temple. As one of his first American visitors, I sat on my haunches on the straw mat and remembered Rosemary Taylor, who lectured on the conditions in Vietnam. My wish that my sons wouldn't be sent here to fight, and that I could make a humanitarian contribution instead, had been granted. In 25 years, I had gathered the resources to support self-help projects in Vietnam. When I travelled to Asia, I saw a different style of communism than what I knew in Europe. Communism in Asia seemed to thrive while it withered in Eastern Europe. In East Germany, it was like a thorn. On my way back from one of my trips to Romania, I heard before America did that the Berlin Wall was torn down, stone by stone, by Germans determined to reunite the East and West. The reason I was on my way back from Romania was that Houstonians saw the footage of neglected Romanian orphans on the television show 20/20ths, and reacted by impulsively booking a flight to find an orphan to adopt. Romania did not have any laws in place, which left the field wide open for child traffickers. I travelled to Romania several times in the midst of this chaos, On one trip, I helped an adoptive father from Mexia, Texas, where I had once been held captive. We needed to get his child a U.S. orphan visa during a miners' strike in Bucharest that threatened to paralyze the city. Streets were filled with thousands of sooty, angry men in miners' hats who wielded truncheons. Police and the Romanian army were nowhere in evidence. The riot was out of control. All of the government buildings, including the U.S. consulate where orphan visas were issued, shut down. Tanks protected the presidential palace, and U.S. Marines guarded the U.S. embassy. Over the phone, I arranged to get inside the embassy to get the visa. The consul told me to enter by an inconspicuous side door. I hired a car with German, not Romanian license plates, in the hope the miners would see that we were not involved in their strike. The entrance to the embassy was surrounded by a fierce mob. Angry fists pounded on the car as we caught sight of some miners beating up a photojournalist, whom we later discovered was French. I was afraid they would tip over the car, or that the driver would not circle the building as I had asked. He hung in there and found the side door the consul had told me about. Staff of both the consulate and the embassy had locked themselves in as a safety precaution, and the consul bravely handled the visa process as usual. We nervously shuffled papers with her and prayed that the miners wouldn't decide to break into the compound. The staff stayed close to a radio. One of them told the consul that the insurgents had threatened to close the airport. I had already thought about the closest border and had a contingency plan to pick up the child and exit through Hungary. The adoptive father wasn't half as worried as I was, but he had never been through a war. Fortunately, the taxi driver swung by to pick us up at the U.S. Embassy, and the airport was still open the next day. The rest of the trip was uneventful. Eventually, the government and the miners reached an agreement, and everyone went back to work. But criminals, whose hearts were blacker than the clothes of the miners, appeared, and soon there was more to fear as they gained entrance to orphanages. Eventually, the government cracked down and created a Romanian adoption committee. The committee controls adoptions throughout the country. A Romanian national with American citizenship became our attorney and heads a non-profit foundation to care for children. When the Romanian Parliament convened to conduct hearings in 4 languages on international adoption policies, she made certain that we had a seat. The RAC has a goal in mind. They want to close the orphanages and license private foster homes to care for the children in order to raise the orphans' quality of life. Many Romanian orphans will find homes in America. Eastern European countries look to Romania as a leader in the establishment of good international adoption practices. In May of 1993, after 3 years of international negotiations for an international treaty regulating the placement of children across national boundaries, a document was ready for signature. Over 60 nations were slated to attend the convention and sign it at The Hague, Netherlands. The full title of the convention is the Hague Convention on Protection of Children and Cooperation in Respect of Intercountry Adoption. The convention will regulate the manner in which countries will accept each other's laws. They will establish authorities to avoid the pitfalls that still exist today. The treaty will create more responsibility for child-placing authorities in each country to curtail illegal activities by unlicensed persons or entities. All U.S. agencies will have to undergo accreditation by government-authorized bodies. These will be determined in the implementation laws of Congress. Although it took a year of hard work, I made certain that Los Niños International Adoption Center was the first in the United States to be accredited. I wanted to be the one to put the standards into practice and help other agencies to do so. As a member of IVAAN, I participated at the international meeting in The Hague, Holland, and took our children along, except for Omar. He was already in Europe, and we picked U.S. Army Specialist Omar Eriksson up in Germany, where he was stationed. Once again, our family travelled together in a Volkswagen van and enjoyed a combination work-vacation in northern Germany and the Netherlands. From the Netherlands, Jean and I flew to Moscow, and the rest of the family went back to where they had come from. We were in Russia at the invitation of the Ministry of Health and Education. I spoke at the first International Adoption Symposium held for Russia's regional child-placing authorities. Reputable American adoption agencies were in attendance. However, there were no safeguards in place to eliminate grey and black marketeers. Individuals with no ethics and no credentials turned the placement of orphans into a business. I've been back to visit orphanages and regional ministries many times. We've placed hundreds of orphans. The shift from countries with civil war or unrest to countries who either discarded communism or are struggling to replace planned economies with free market systems has changed the international adoption scene. In Russia, the number of children who end up in institutions has not abated. In 1999, we met with our coordinators from several Russian regions to further refine our procedures. The enormous economically depressed country sends more orphans to America than any other nation. An estimated 4,500 Russian children were adopted by US citizens in 1999. During that trip, my wife and I trod once more in Red Square and prayed in the perfectly restored onion-domed churches. Close by was the statue of a man I recognized. You can't get away from war monuments and memorials in Moscow. So many wars, so many fallen soldiers. We passed the statue of Germany's former World War II nemesis, Marshal Zhukov, astride a horse when he commanded the ground war. I had no desire for a photo op with his statue. We wandered the free market, where a booth displayed Russian World War II uniforms, weapons and medals. It was all for sale, including German SS helmets. I'd much rather acquire vitamins and medicines for institutionalized children than own one single piece of military hardware. We've placed hundreds of orphans, and will place hundreds more in the future, thanks to an accreditation process that Russia devised in 2000. Only well-established adoption agencies qualify. Los Niños International was accredited that same year. Tons of food and supplies are continually sent to third world orphanages by adoptive parents and coalitions of adoption agencies. We talk over the phone, email each other, and meet to discuss laws, procedures, and ways to help children. One such agency, Spence Chapin of New York, encouraged our agency to join them in placing Bulgarian orphans through a licensed non-profit Bulgarian foundation. When I booked tickets to Sofia, I suddenly remembered the infamous Bulgarian communist Georgy Dimitrov, who was accused of setting the Reichstag fire in Berlin. The Nazis arrested him in 1933. Every town in Bulgaria used to have a street named after him. Chance, happenstance, and 20/20ths brought me back to Europe. As my mother once said, God works in mysterious ways. A miracle had saved me from being crushed under the traumatic juggernaut of the Africa Corps. But those of us repatriated to Germany were called the Lost Generation. According to political strategists, we who survived the Nazi debacle were so indoctrinated that we were written off as hopeless. 50 years after the war, old movies and books still portray all of us as Nazis. I've spent much of my life trying to prove them wrong. It's been a long expedition from the day I marched into captivity to the position I created as the founder and director of one of the largest international adoption agencies in the United States. Dr. Viktor Frankl, German psychiatrist and survivor of 4 concentration camps, said in Man's Search for Meaning that everyone needs a purpose in life. Suffering and loss, as well as survivor's guilt, often lead to what he terms tragic optimism. It certainly led to my need for meaning in my life and the zest to fulfill it. My opposition to war was what catapulted me into saving orphans. The children I raised, as well as those placed in families through our agency, are my immortality. My next orphan-saving expedition could be to Bosnia, to Kosovo, or wherever the needs of orphans lead me. When a newly arrived infant reaches out for me to hold him, we spiritually connect. He trusts his instincts, just as I trust mine on adoption journeys. As God's servant, I follow rules and handle paperwork knowing that God, not man, has picked the right parents. In 1998, Kirk married Crystal, a multiracial African-American who was educated in Switzerland. They have a daughter named Ariana Kirklin. Kirk developed our computer system and our graphics. He's a computer wizard, writer, and artist. That same year, Tatiana married Nabil, a Muslim Pakistani who was educated in England. Tatiana is our office manager and event planner. Rosanna graduated with a degree in business with a major in accounting. Rosanna is our administrator/accountant. She will succeed me when I retire. Omar is in his last semester at the University of Texas, where he majors in international relations and Latin American studies. Omar was a gubernatorial aide to Congressman Kevin Brady and to Governor Bush. My children sparkle like diplomats with foreign guests of honor, adoptive parents, and of course the children, to whom they are like big sisters and big brothers. As to the orphans themselves, the adoption of foreign children by U.S. citizens rose from around 3,000 in 1973, when we adopted the twins, to more than 17,000 in the year 2000. Europe showing route from northern Germany to Tunisia, North Africa. Maps by Kirk Erickson. Back, James. Other losses. An investigation into the mass deaths of German prisoners at the hands of the French and Americans after World War II. Toronto, Canada. Stoddart, 1989. Bard, Mitchell. Forgotten Victims. The Abandonment of Americans in Hitler's Camps. Boulder. Westview Press, 1994. Bender, James. Uniforms, Organizations and History of the Africa Corps. San Jose, Calipur R. James Bender. Publishing, 1973. Doyle, Robert. Voices from Captivity, Interpreting the American POW Narrative. Lawrence, Kansas. University Press of Kansas, 1994. Gertner, Georg with Arnold Kramer, Hitler's Last Soldier in America. New York, Stein and Day, 1985. Hohner, Heinz, Die Machtergreifung, The Seizing of Power, Deutschland's Weg in die Hitler-Diktatur. Reinbeck, B. Hamburg, Revolt, 1983. Kempf, Gary. History of Fort Knox, Battles, Maps, Extinct Towns, Churches and Schools, 1998. Kloner, Arno, Jugend im Dritten Reich, Youth in the Third Reich, Die Hitler-Jugend und ihre Gegner, Dokumente und Analysen. Dusseldorf, Diedericks, 1982. Kramer, Arnold, Nazi Prisoners of War in America. New York, Stein and Day, 1979. Liddell Hart, B.H., ed. with Lucy Marie Rommel, Manfred Rommel and Fritz Bayerlein. The Rommel Papers. New York, Da Capo Press, 1982-1953. Moore, Bob POWs and Their Captives in Warrit, London, Berg, 1996. Sandulescu, Jacques. Hunger's Rogues. On the Black Market in Europe, 1948. New York, Harcourt Brace Jovanovic, 1974. Christianity in Germany. Of approximately 66 million in pre-war Germany, 41.4% were Protestants and 22.7% were Roman Catholics. Protestants were grouped into 28 territorial churches. Hanover, Württemberg and Bavaria were Lutheran. The remainder were evangelicals or combined Lutheran and Calvinists. Ersatzkaffee, German war coffee of roasted barley, was also issued to troops at home. True coffee was imported and considered a luxury. Geneva Convention, revised in 1929 by 47 nations, the document deals with rules of warfare and treatment of POWs. In 1949, an update of the convention dealt particularly with questions regarding prisoners of war and civilian internees. German language, part of the West Germanic branch of languages to which English, Dutch, Low German and Frisian also belong. The North Germanic group includes Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, and Icelandic. Although German is the standard language of Germany, Austria, and the German-speaking part of Switzerland, there are various dialects spoken besides standard High German. In the northern or low parts of Germany, Low German dialects are spoken in Westphalia, Schleswig-Holstein, Mecklenburg, and Lower Saxony. German Revolution, Kiel, November 1918. Sailors refused to sail for battle. A mutiny where the red flag was hoisted and the arrest of officers followed. Kiel was founded in 1242 and joined the Hanseatic League, a confederation of German merchants and cities on the Baltic Sea. The city became a Prussian naval port, and in 1871 the German Imperial Reich Empire proclaimed it the port for the Imperial Navy. After the victory over France, the city grew rapidly. The natural harbour connected to the Baltic was surrounded by shipyards and naval installations. After Germany's loss of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, Kiel's economy deteriorated. Under the Potsdam Agreement in 1945, Schleswig-Holstein became a state with Kiel as the future capital. The war ended before any ground fighting could occur in Schleswig-Holstein. Only Kiel and Lübeck had experienced heavy bombing. An international organization formed by the peace treaty ending World War I. It operated from 1920 and ended officially in 1946, when the United Nations had been established. The US Senate never ratified the treaty. Italy and Germany left the League. It was not very effective. Site of a German POW camp. This was my second POW camp in Texas, the one that they kicked me out of. This policy for Europe began in 1947, helped Western Europe's damaged industries to be rebuilt. The Soviet Union didn't allow such aid to reach east of the Iron Curtain, since their plan used the chaos in Western Europe to create strong communist parties. Eventually, the GDR, German Democratic Republic, became somewhat of a model for Eastern Europe. Cadres of communists had fled to the Soviet Union in 1933 when Hitler came to power, and thereafter when the Nazis threatened and took over country after country. They entered the Soviet zone, first as instruments of the Soviet occupation, and later under the tutorship of the Soviets as the new leaders of the GDR. In spite of much of the squalor and industrial backwardness of the GDR at reunification, people in the GDR lived better than the average citizen of the Soviet Union at that time. Named after Henry Morgenthau, Under-Secretary of the Treasury in 1934 under Franklin D. Roosevelt. The plan called for the total destruction of Germany's industrial base and its conversion into an agricultural area. The plan fell victim to the Korean War and the creation of the Marshall Plan under President Truman. Germany had already suffered total defeat after a total war. The occupying Western powers had to restore the infrastructure to keep the populace alive and, at the same time, hunt down and prosecute war criminals. At the same time, Soviets who occupied the East dismantled everything valuable they could find and loaded it into boxcars destined for Russia. The National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, NSAP, German Workers' Party, primarily known by the acronym formed from the first and sixth syllables, Nazi. The extension of NATO and the European Union to the East, beginning after the NATO conference in Madrid in July of 1997, is a repudiation of the decisions made at Yalta and Potsdam by President Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Stalin. After Hitler and Stalin had dismembered and divided Poland, the new Poland of 1945 was compensated by Stalin for its loss of territory to the Soviet Union by obtaining large areas of Germany. Czechoslovakia, dismembered by Hitler with the consent of Great Britain, France, and Italy in 1938, now fell under Soviet rule. Both countries joined NATO in 1999. Hungary, a former German ally, also became a Soviet satellite in 1945. In 1956, however, a bloody uprising collapsed under Soviet tanks. The West watched, but did not help. Hungary, too, joined NATO in 1999. The Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall, as well as the partition of East and West Germany, ended years ago. The Soviet Union is no more. Hopefully, a more peaceful and united Europe will emerge at the beginning of the next century. The constant European wars and border changes have not yet ended. Yugoslavia has not settled its differences. Let us pray for enlightenment that will bring peace to the world in the 21st century. Also called the Holy Roman Empire, in 1200 AD it included all of later Germany, Austria, Bohemia and Moravia, Switzerland, Holland, Belgium, and the eastern part of France, parts of Italy below Rome, as well as Corsica and Sardinia. On December 29, 1165, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne, Charles the Great, as the ancestor of the Germanic line. Bismarck, the Chancellor of the Kingdom of Prussia, declared the Prussian King Emperor of Germany after the victory of the combined forces of German kingdoms and minor entities over France. Listed as one of conspirators in the attempted assassination of Hitler. Rommel was recovering at home from wounds suffered in an Allied strafing attack in France. SS surrounded his house. He got a choice. Either his entire family would be arrested, or he could go along with them and take cyanide. He took the poison and died soon after. The Nazis kept his name out of the list of those arrested. Rommel was given a state funeral because of his popularity. In 1460, King Christian I of Denmark became the Duke of Schleswig and Count of Holstein. He guaranteed independence from Denmark and the unity of Schleswig-Holstein. The coat of arms has the inscription, in Low German, Upp ewig ungedelt, which translates to forever unseparated. In 1721, the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, Karl Friedrich, lost claim to Schleswig and was limited to a part of Holstein surrounding Kiel. He married the daughter of Peter the Great of Russia, and his son, Karl Peter Ulrich, later became Peter III on the Russian throne. After his assassination, his wife Katerina became Tsarina of Russia and regent of Holstein. She ceded the small dukedom to the King of Denmark in 1773. The King of Denmark reunited Schleswig and Holstein. In 1848, a provisional government was established in Kiel to sever the ties to Denmark. This failed in 1850. In 1864, Austria and Prussia fought Denmark, and after their victory, the territory fell under joint Austro-Prussian administration. Prussia's victory over Austria in 1866 brought Schleswig-Holstein under sole Prussian administration as a province. In 1919, under a plebiscite of the League of Nations, the northern part of the state, known as North Schleswig in Germany and South Jutland in Denmark, of which the majority had voted for joining Denmark, became Danish territory. Although a pro-Danish party existed in 1945, no attempt for a new election was made because the influx of refugees from Pomerania, Silesia, and East Prussia was so strong that it was at least 1-to-1 or more per native. Script, German replaced by Latin cursive. Schnellkommando, rapid commando. Units attached to police and fire stations as a part of civil air defense, Luftschutz. Hitler Youth were volunteered to dig people out from bombed-out buildings and to extinguish incendiary bombs used at the beginning of the air war. Trisonia. The three Western powers joined their zones after the currency reforms in 1948. First called Trisonia, it eventually became the Federal Republic of Germany, commonly called West Germany. The eastern part, the Soviet zone, became the German Democratic Republic. Communist governments preferred the word democratic to be in their countries' names to give the misconception of democracy. Unemployment. 1932. In the wake of the US Depression and the crash of Wall Street, the German economy nearly collapsed. Unemployment rose to 6 million. The economic unrest and constantly failing governments, ruling only by decree, brought the Communists and the Nazis into fierce opposition in their struggle for power. Industrialists made a pact with the Nazis, and a Nazi conservative government was formed. President von Hindenburg appointed Hitler Chancellor since the coalition had a majority. The Nazis asked the Reichstag, Parliament, for power for a limited time. The Ermächtigungsgesetz, Empowering Act, dissolved Parliament. Communist delegates already had been arrested and were in protective custody. Only the Social Democrats opposed the act. They were hunted when they left Parliament. Many escaped by boat to Sweden and Denmark. Unconditional surrender. This was demanded of Germany by the Allies, and in May of 1945, after Hitler's death and the meeting of Soviet and US forces on the Elbe River, was accepted by a totally defeated and destroyed Germany. Victors, the Allies. The United States was fortunate never to have had to suffer the destruction of an air war, which most of Europe experienced. Also, the US never lost a war. Even though neither Korea nor Vietnam were victories, these were negotiated ceasefires or withdrawals. The Vietnam vets did not receive heroes' welcomes, and often suffered humiliation by a nation that had failed to support their troops. Only those US servicemen who were present in Europe in the spring of 1945 know the devastation of the cities, roads, bridges, and railways. Millions of people were expelled from their homes in Eastern European countries, and DPs, displaced persons, mostly involuntary forced labour not wanting to return to their new communist-controlled countries, sitting and waiting to immigrate to Canada, the US, Australia, etc., were crowded in camps. World War II. It began in Europe with Germany's invasion of Poland in August of 1939. England and France opposed this and declared war on Germany. Nazi Germany had made a secret pact with the Soviet Union to split Poland between these two powers. The Soviets invaded Poland from the east. Germany was allied with fascist Italy and Imperial Japan. Nazi Germany invaded neutral Holland and Belgium to attack the French Maginot fortification line from the rear. Next was the invasion of Denmark and Norway. Yugoslavia followed. Italy had invaded Albania and Greece. Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary and Finland allied with Germany to attack the Soviet Union in June of 1941. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Germany declared war on the US, only Sweden, Switzerland and Portugal remained neutral. Spain was pro-German but remained out of the fighting. Italy changed sides after the failed North African campaign and was occupied by Germany. In 1945, after the German surrender, Germany was split into 4 zones of occupation: American, British, French and Soviet. To compensate the new Poland for its losses of territory to the Soviet Union, Silesia, Pomerania and East Prussia were severed, and most of the population expelled. East Prussia was split between Poland and the Soviet Union. The latter part, around former Königsberg, became the Kaliningrad region of Russia